Okay, so to round out the evening, Karen, I can't say, I just love Karen. She's just the best. And she's happily retired after 33 years in local government, which is going to be incorporated in her story in a way that you may not imagine. So you'll get to hear a little Gainesville lore mixed in. She breaks out in hives when she thinks about having to deal with all those politics again. So we're glad that she's done with that and happily retired. We don't want her to break out in hives tonight. She's traveled to all 7 continents with her partner and now wife of 28 years. She loves the outdoors and is an active volunteer at the Lowell Women's Prison. So if any of you have heard of the Mommy Reads program, Karen is one of the founders of that program, and she's just an amazing woman. So here's Karen to close our show.
My name is Karen, and I am an adult onset lesbian. Now, we all know that's not biologically true, but it really was for me in terms of my conscious awareness. I lived the first 34 years of my life focusing on my career, doing things with my friends and family, and really occasionally despairing about why I had never really had a serious romantic relationship. And I was living and working in small-town Texas when it finally hit me that the Rosetta Stone to probably explaining my past was that I was a lesbian. But keep in mind, this was like 10 years before Ellen came out on TV, and about 20 years before Brokeback Mountain became perhaps the first commercial movie to portray gay sex in a loving manner. And all of my friends in Texas were straight. And while they would have been supportive, most of them were like engineers and scientists and real logical finance types like me. I mean, I have a local friend here who occasionally calls me Spock. And so I think I responded in a very practical and logical way. I got myself to a therapist, and then I spent the next year or so dating men like crazy, trying to prove to myself that it wasn't true. I moved to Gainesville in 1989 to be the assistant city manager. And in that job, I was responsible for things like helping to prepare the city's budget, and I was management's representative in negotiating union contracts, and I gave reports to the city commission. Basically just a lot of administrative stuff. And it certainly also was in the back of my mind that maybe Gainesville would be a place where I could better explore my sexual orientation. But again, keep in mind that back then, it really was no picnic to be gay or lesbian, even in Gainesville. Just as one example, the United Church of Gainesville, which many of us know to be a place that just robustly welcomes people of all sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, UCG at that point had not yet even begun their 3-year process of discernment to become an open and affirming church. And when they did vote to do so in 1992, they both lost and gained members as a result. So in that milieu here in Gainesville, in the lesbian subculture, perhaps more affectionately known as the women's community, was divided into at least a couple of distinct subgroups. People who were in mainstream positions like me tended to be very, very heavily closeted. I mean, you practically had to be like a CIA operative and have your secret decoder ring in order to break into that network. And so really, as a newcomer to Gainesville who was still exploring my sexual orientation, that group was just hidden to me and simply not accessible. And the part of the women's community that was accessible to me was often mystifying, at times kind of borderline terrifying. It was sort of like I was in a foreign country where I knew nothing of the culture or the customs and where I barely spoke the language. I mean, I can remember going to a commitment ceremony out on a farm out east of Melrose. And the guests there, all women, of course, were in a big field, in a big circle out in a field. And the two brides were in the center of the circle, absolutely freaking butt naked as jaybirds. And, you know, this was really unlike any heterosexual destination wedding I'd ever previously attended. And I was at a campfire one night, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, good, you know, s'mores, kumbaya, all of that. And then all of a sudden, some people started chanting, and somebody handed me a tom-tom for the drum circle. And I mean, those of you that know me know that I just really am not a chanter. But all I could think to say was thanks, I've been trying to quit. For the first time in my life, I met people who believe that it actually matters if Mercury is in retrograde. And I was at a dinner party one evening, and everybody but me was talking about their past lives as if they were just real and knowable and literal occurrences. And I mean, I could not have felt more isolated had I been with a bunch of evangelical Christians who were talking about their future lives after the rapture. You know, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, like, really? I mean, I am having enough trouble just trying to figure out this one life. And I certainly do not have any head time to be thinking about any others. You know, there was really nothing in my daily reading of the Wall Street Journal that had prepared me for any of this. And then, on June 1st, 1992, the seeming normalcy of my professional world was shattered. The Alachua County Commission was considering adding sexual orientation to its list of protected classes in its human rights ordinance. And one of our longtime city commissioners, Cortland Collier, was really opposed to this. He saw it as an unduly advancing the homosexual agenda. He was really having his Anita Bryant moment. So anyway, he prepared a resolution for the city commission to consider. And it was really long and disgusting, but the gist of it was that if sexual orientation were included as a protected class, it would more or less be like the gateway drug to other sexual interests like bestiality, necrophilia, and pedophilia. And I cried tears of just utter disbelief when that resolution passed by a 3-2 vote and became an official policy statement of the city of Gainesville. Now, happily, there were at least 2 city commissioners, Paula Delaney and Rodney Long, who voted against this resolution. But I was still just shattered by the fact that in this seemingly liberal university town, there were 3 elected officials, people that I worked with on an almost daily basis, who were so overwrought with prejudice or fear or perhaps even hatred that they would just vote for this abomination. And needless to say that really drove me further into the closet, more into a place of fear. And this big idea of moving to Gainesville so I could live a more whole and integrated life just really wasn't working out too well for me. Now, meanwhile, career-wise, I had moved over to be assistant general manager of Gainesville Regional Utilities. And as many of you probably know, GRU is still part of the city, it's just the other side of the house. And on the city management side of the house, the city manager and his senior staff were dying deaths of 1,000 cuts of their own making through just a lot of professional incompetence. There were travel scandals. A joint was found in the ashtray of the city manager's car. Just a whole series of administrative and ethical lapses. And so some of the city commissioners started making inquiries of my boss at GRU about whether I would be willing to come back and be the city manager if they fired the present one. Now you can imagine this caused a big dilemma for me. I mean, these were, after all, the same people that had voted for bestiality and necrophilia. And, you know, it's one thing to be the invisible assistant general manager of the utility where, in contrast to the Cheers bar, nobody knows your name. It's a whole other thing to be highly closeted, but in a very public position like the city manager. But as I looked at the situation, I realized that the city commissioners had at least as big a dilemma as I did. I mean, both the liberals and the conservatives on the commission were just growing weary of the almost daily embarrassing headlines that were a complete distraction from getting anything of substance done. And they desperately needed a calm and logical Spock to come in from the outside, to do a little house cleaning, and then to settle things down. But I also realized that the only way that I could inoculate myself from my sexual orientation potentially becoming an issue would be if I came out to all the city commissioners before they considered appointing me. And that way, if that ever then became a matter of public discussion for whatever reason, they would have appointed me knowingly and willingly. And so, I did. When I met with Paula Delaney, she just smiled and shrugged and she just said, hey, let's talk about the job that needs to be done here. I had a very poignant meeting with Rodney Long because, you know, he told me that everything in his religious upbringing had taught him that homosexuality was wrong. But he said, I believe in equality, so you will have my support. I met with one of the commissioners who had voted for bestiality, and it was actually kind of a hilarious meeting. He was just as nervous, or he was just as fidgety and squirmy as a 2-year-old. And there was absolutely nothing on this earth that could have gotten his lips to articulate the L word. But nonetheless, he said fine. And I saved meeting with Cortland Collier till the last. And as after I told him, he looked at me and just kind of responded absolutely without any affect, and in a completely toneless voice, he said, I don't think your sexual preference has anything to do with the job. But then he leaned in, and with much more emotion, he said, as long as you don't proselytize. And at that point in my life, I really did not need any more toaster ovens, so that was not a deal breaker. And for any of you who don't understand that, toaster ovens are really the traditional bonus premium for winners of the lesbian recruitment drive. So anyway, on February 28th, 1994, when I woke up that morning, I was the invisible, highly closeted assistant general manager of GRU. And when I went to bed that night, I was the interim city manager who had outed myself to all of the city commissioners. Thank you. And I stayed on in that position for 15 months. And during that time, Cortland Collier went off the city commission. And the city commissioners unanimously asked me if I would stay on as the permanent city manager. But as recent events here in Gainesville indicate, there really is no such thing. And besides, that kind of public visibility really isn't in my DNA, and so I eventually went back to my position at GRU. But as more and more of us felt comfortable coming out, I think people began to realize that for many of us at least, the only real homosexual agenda was to be able to live as ordinary a life as our parents did without being hassled about it. And over the next several years, there were more new elected officials. And so the city commission then eventually overrode that horrible resolution. They added sexual orientation to the city's list of protected classes, and they began to offer domestic partner benefits to city employees. And in the ensuing years, there have been many more changes that have made Gainesville now the much more LGBTQ-friendly place that we all know it to be today. And yet I think we also all know that there's still much work to be done, and it's not just for the LGBTQ community. It's my fervent hope that someday we will have a world where marginalized people of all kinds can come out, be their authentic best selves, and truly live long and prosper. Thank you.